Okay, we're going to talk today about World War II. We've been discussing the build-up to the war and then the early stages of the war last time. I want to concentrate on the part of World War II after the United States enters the war today. We'll take a look at basically what happened in 1941, very end of 1941, through 1945. Throughout 1941, there was a buildup of tensions between the United States and Japan. July 26th, the U.S. froze Japanese assets and suspended diplomatic relations with Japan. And on August 1st, the U.S. declared an oil embargo against Japan. The first, well, made certainly some difference, alerted the Japanese to the fact that war was a possibility. But the second was more serious because the Japanese depended heavily on oil and didn't themselves have sources of oil. That's part of the reason for their expansionism in the late 30s and early 40s. Here you have a map of what the United States was reacting to. Japan had been, first of all, in the early 30s attacking Manchuria and northeastern China. And as you see, it not limited the attacks to one area of Manchuria, but was actually pressing into a number of regions in China. There were also attacks against French Indochina, against Thailand, Burma, against what is today Indonesia, then was described as the Dutch East Indies. Here, the Philippines, eventually. And as you'll see, well, yes, attacks on Hawaii and so on, but those were yet to come. Still, the expansion towards Southeast Asia was already taking place. And that was what the United States was alarmed about. Japanese aggression against China and against other Asian countries was beginning to alarm people that Japan was trying to take over the entire Western Pacific, all of East Asia. On December 7th, famously, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. And here you see the Honolulu Star Bulletin of the next day, war, Oahu bombed by Japanese planes. The very next day, the United States declared war against Japan. It was a significant attack. Pearl Harbor was really the chief naval base and base for aerial operations in the Pacific, and it was a major strike. It devastated much of the Pacific Fleet. So you see here actually what Japan was doing at the same time. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th is the famous one, but there were also attacks against Wake, against Truk, against Guam, against New Guinea, against the Philippines, Hong Kong, various areas in Thailand, and so on, as well as in the Dutch East Indies. So all of those were happening simultaneously on December 7th. It was kind of a massive attack on many different fronts. Here you see some scenes from Pearl Harbor. It was a devastating attack partly because it really was unexpected. And the planes were just sitting there on the runways, the ships were just sitting there in the harbor. Some people have alleged in the sort of conspiracy theory that Roosevelt knew this was going to happen and did nothing so that there would be fervor to enter the war. But to risk destroying your entire Pacific Fleet for that purpose seems to me bizarre. So I don't think that is at all plausible. In any case, you can see here the effect on the planes on the ground. Hangars burning. So here is Roosevelt signing the declaration of war. And of course he gave that famous speech, yesterday, December 7th, a day which will live in infamy, etc. Now, December 11th, Italy and Germany declared war on the United States. Now I've got a question for you. Why? Yes, there was a treaty, okay, a pact between the Axis powers that said they would come to their mutual defense. On the other hand, at the moment, the United States simply had reason to go to war with Japan, had no actual reason to go to war with Italy or Germany. And so Hitler had planned eventually to go to war against the United States, but that plan was 50 years into the future, right? That was to be something that happened eventually, around the end of the century, basically around the time when he had solidified his European empire, had defeated the Soviet Union, etc., etc. And so why did he do it? After all, it's not like there's so much honor among the Axis powers that he was afraid of betraying a treaty. I mean, look what he had done to Russia just a few months before. So anyway, that basically guaranteed the German defeat. Putting the United States on one side tipped the balance of power the other way. As we've seen, the move of Czechoslovakia from one side to the other side tipped the balance of power heavily in Hitler's favor. But putting the United States on the other side tipped it strongly against him. And so it's striking And I think somewhat bizarre that he did this move so quickly. In any case, shortly thereafter, he took complete control of the German army. He made it clear that he was commander-in-chief, that he was to have power over all the rest of the generals. Now, whatever Hitler was thinking, let's think about what Japan was thinking. What was going on in their reasoning behind the attack on Pearl Harbor? Well, there was really no plan beyond the first 6 months of the war. There was no plan for knocking the US out of the war. There was no plan for supplying forces throughout Southern Asia and the Pacific. And so you might think, look, this isn't a very good strategy, right? So there's no plan beyond 6 months, no plan for resupplying troops, no plan for driving the US out of the war, defeating the United States. So what on earth were they thinking? What was the strategy? Yeah.
Maybe they thought they could negotiate a lift of the oil embargo or something of that sort.
Okay, good.
Instead of going to war, just give us oil and leave it alone.
I think that's exactly right. I think their thought was they could devastate the Pacific Fleet and say, remove the oil embargo, and the United States would have no choice but to go along. So I think they thought that they could devastate American power in the Pacific so quickly that the United States would sue for peace on terms that were favorable to Japan. They would essentially get a green light to do what they wanted in Southeast Asia, get the oil embargo lifted, and in general, make this quick knockout blow. But if the first blow doesn't work, then you're in trouble. It's kind of like you walk up to a guy who's much bigger than you are, and you just sucker punch him, right? Well, if you knock him out, okay. But if you don't, you're deep-duty, right? And that's in effect what the Japanese tried to do, I think. They were like, this was a sucker punch, and the idea was supposed to be, pow, make it so devastating the United States would say, oh, all right, yeah, our mistake, oil embargo. We didn't mean that, forget it, and so on. But if you look at what was actually going on behind the scenes in Japan, I wish it were that clear a case. It's actually rather unclear. Japan's naval minister said the foreign minister, Matsuoka, is insane, isn't he? That was to one other cabinet official. Anyone who voiced objections to the plan of attack faced assassination. Here is Tojo, the military leader of the Japanese forces in the Second World War. He said, there are times when we must have the courage to do extraordinary things, like jumping with eyes closed off the veranda of the Kiyomizu Temple. Here is the Kiyomizu Temple, so you can get an idea of what that means. Woo! Okay, it's built on a hillside. Now, here are actual minutes of the November 1st liaison conference where the Japanese High Command made the decision to attack Pearl Harbor. It is absolutely astounding to read this document. Here's how part of the discussion goes. Finance Minister Kaya says, if we go along as at present, without war, and 3 years hence the American fleet comes to attack us, will the Navy have a chance of winning or won't it? Now, he asked this question several times. He asked this question, no one responds. There's just silence in the room. So he asks it again. If the American fleet comes and attacks us, will we have a chance or not? Again, silence. He asks it a third time. Finally, the Naval Chief of Staff, Admiral Nagano, pictured there, says, nobody knows. So, Kaya then says, well, will the American fleet come to attack us or won't it? Nagano says, I don't know. Kaya says, I don't think they'll come. Nagano says, we might avoid war now, but go to war 3 years later. Or we might go to war now and plan for what the situation will be in 3 years. I think it would be easier to engage in war now. Okay, now this is the level of strategic thinking. Sometimes people get these grand conspiracy theories. They think our opponents have all these complex plans. They're like chess masters thinking it out 10 moves in advance. And then when you see, and by the way, I don't mean to suggest that the American leadership is that much better. When I was young, about your age, the Pentagon Papers came out and the Nixon tapes and all of that, so you got to actually glimpse some of the Oval Office discussions among the American president and top advisors and so on. And it was incredibly depressing. Forget the Watergate stuff and all of that. It was depressing because it's like, gosh, this is the level of discussion. I was a young philosophy major. I somehow imagined that they'd be sitting there and saying, well, think about Book 7 of Plato's Republic and the worries he had about democracy. And someone else will say, yes, but in Aristotle's politics, the blah, 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 blah. And it's not like that, right? It's not like that at all. It's like that schmuck from Wisconsin voted against us. What do we do about it? This type of thing. And so here, it's like, oh my gosh, chess masters thinking several moves ahead. No, they're like blundering around. And so it's absolutely amazing to see the utter lack of strategy here. Now, in any case, to the extent that there was a plan, here was the plan. to push Japanese influence all the way up to the boundaries of India, which succeeded rather nicely, to push it down to the boundaries of Australia, again, which for a while succeeded, to push things east all the way to Midway and finally to Hawaii, and also to attack the Aleutian Islands, and so really to take over a very large area of the Pacific. That was the plan, and indeed it was largely accomplished. You can see that these are the sort of furthest boundaries in June and August of 42. Japan had actually accomplished much of this. However, it wasn't to last. May 4th through 8th, so 6 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, was the Battle of the Coral Sea, and 1 month after that was the Battle of Midway. They were both decisive battles, decisive American victories, and also victories based on sheer luck. There's a movie about Midway called Midway, and yes, it's got a love story and all of that, but it actually also has a lot of real war footage in it, and it indicates just how unbelievably lucky the United States was to actually stumble upon the attack plan, to have some planes basically fly off course and catch the Japanese fleet sailing toward Midway, giving people an alert about the attack that was supposed to be a surprise. In any case, after Midway, it was really all a question of the United States pushing Japan back toward the home island. The Japanese had lost control of the Pacific after just 6 months. So after 6 months, the United States was supposed to be belly up, begging for peace. In fact, it should have been the other way. So the first conflict was the Battle of the Coral Sea. It took place down in this region of the Pacific. You can see why it mattered so much. It was really, in some sense, to defend Australia. Okay, from the American point of view, it had to do with control of, well, the Dutch East Indies, broadly here, but also protecting Australia. The Japanese thought of invading Australia. They did bomb Australia. They never actually invaded. But you can see here the overall plan zoomed in on this area. The Coral Sea is right here, and so it's a key to this part of the Pacific and also to Australia and New Zealand. Now here was the plan. The Japanese had several carriers heading toward the Coral Sea. The Americans had the Lexington, but also the Yorktown was already down there. In addition, there were some Australian naval forces. Those were the initial movements. Here was the Japanese attack plan. This was what was supposed to happen. The Japanese politicians may have had no idea what was going on, but as you see, the naval commanders, once you got Nagano out of the committee room and planning this, then there was a complicated plan of what the movements were to be, and you can see, defeat the US fleet there. Here's what actually happened. Somewhat more complicated. Okay, so this actually shows things in detail. This is an interesting map to study. You can see here a Japanese carrier being attacked and sunk. Here the Lexington, attacked and sunk. Here, additional Japanese carriers. One American carrier, the Japanese thought they had destroyed, but in fact, it was able to repair itself on the way to Midway and take part in the Battle of Midway. In any case, here are some scenes from the Battle of the Coral Sea. That's the Lexington just after it was hit. Here are people abandoning the Lexington. You can see hundreds of soldiers jumping into the sea off the burning ship. Well then, Midway was further up, north in the Pacific. Right here, in the center, here's Hawaii. Japan is over there. There's the tip of Alaska. And so it was really the thing that controlled the Central Pacific. Midway, we had a base on Midway. There weren't many people there. There weren't many ships there. But there were Japanese forces heading straight for Midway. The idea was to take Midway, destroy what remained of the American fleet after Pearl Harbor, and then take Hawaii. Well, it didn't quite work out that way either. Initially, there was an attack on the base on Midway. You see oil supplies burning here, and a duck and a turkey getting away. There you see the carriers. By the way, the Coral Sea, that was the first naval battle fought entirely by aircraft. The ships never saw each other. Okay, it was purely our planes attacking their ships, their planes attacking our ships. Midway was similar. And so it was really all a question of aerial combat off of aircraft carriers. Here is a kamikaze who has hit one of the carriers. Well, in any case, what was the United States to do? It had stopped 6 months after the start of the war. It had stopped the Japanese advance. But now there was a huge area of the Pacific between those battlegrounds and the Japanese islands. What was to be the American plan for actually ending the war in the Pacific? The answer was an island hopping strategy. The thought was to gradually advance closer and closer to the Japanese mainland. Doolittle led a raid in 1942, actually bombing Tokyo, but it was a kind of crazy move. In some ways dramatic and very good in terms of propaganda and in terms of improving the mood of the nation and so forth. But the fact is almost the entire attack force was lost. It was clear that that kind of very long-range bombing of Japan was of no real military value. And so the United States started this policy of going island to island. The first major battle was at Guadalcanal in August. But by that point, less than a year into the war, U.S. war production was already greater than all of the Axis powers combined. So the United States was turning out more aircraft, more tanks, more ships, and so on than Germany, Japan, and Italy taken together. Well, here you can see where Guadalcanal is. That's New Guinea. This is the tip of Australia. That's, Guam is over there. Hawaii would be over there. So it's pretty far south in the Pacific. And the idea was really a series of battles, hopping islands in this way toward Guam and eventually toward Japan. So here you see the attack on Guadalcanal. Dead on the beach. Troops in fortifications on Guadalcanal. The fight here lasted for a couple of weeks and was incredibly brutal. This is what it would have been like being in an airplane trying to invade. This is a Japanese torpedo plane attack. So I guess that's a view from a ship. You see how low the planes are flying to the water to try to avoid the anti-aircraft fire. That's some aircraft and some U.S. ships burning off the coast of Guadalcanal. Anyway, these were bloody difficult battles. They were things that cost a huge amount in terms of war material, in terms of lives. It was very difficult. In 1942, in Europe, what began in earnest was a bombing campaign. The Allies began to bomb Germany. Britain had an air force that was capable of some degree of bombing, but the Americans had much larger bombers, much longer range bombers. And so they began a bombing campaign starting out against Lubeck, then a 1,000-bomber raid against Cologne in May. In June, Hitler began the mass murder of Jews at Auschwitz. And then, really, what most historians call the decisive battle of the war. On the Eastern Front, September 13th through February 2nd. So that's a more than 5-month-long battle for Stalingrad. Okay? It was brutal, house to house fighting. The German army was devastated. So was the Russian army, actually. It was an incredibly costly battle on both sides. Now, there are a lot of things about World War II that we tend to think of as pretty morally clear-cut. A clear attack on American territory, for example. The evil of Hitler's extermination campaign against the Jews and against other groups he viewed as undesirable. But that's not to say that in the conduct of the war, there weren't all sorts of important and disturbing moral problems. One of them was this, what some people have referred to as the Jupiter complex, i.e. the tossing of lightning bolts. The bombing campaign begun in 1942 by the British and Americans against Germany involved 25% of Britain's war production. Okay, much of what Britain was doing is simply producing bombs to drop on Germany. It ended up killing 600,000 Germans, almost all of them civilians. And so here's one historian's account. We see here the corruptive process of moral relativism at work. Churchill was well aware of the moral decay war brings. He was appalled by it. He had initiated the mass bombing strategy on the 2nd of July, 1940. In other words, during the Battle of Britain, when Germany was bombing London, because he was overwhelmed by the prospect of Nazi occupation, the ultimate moral catastrophe, and saw bombing as the only offensive weapon then available to the British. So he started even before the Americans entered the war, but then much more so once the Americans entered. Here is a scene of Stalingrad. You can see there's not much left of the city that's being fought over. In 1943, the year started with a Casablanca conference between Churchill and Roosevelt to discuss the conduct of the war. A few months later, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, in which people actually banded together to try to fight the Nazi occupation of Warsaw. And the response was simply to destroy much of Warsaw. Here you see rubble left afterwards. Here you see a child in the ghetto looking around at just devastation around. In 1943, by May, Axis forces in North Africa surrendered. I think Hitler was toying with that idea of a southern strategy, but he started it in North Africa. That was probably a mistake. He was defeated by Montgomery, the British commander. July 1st, income tax withholding started in the United States. That's actually something that, as we'll see, has a huge impact on later developments. Now, if you get a paycheck, a certain amount is just deducted in taxes, right? You never see the money. It's gone before you get it. So at the end of the year, you might hope for a refund. And a lot of people think like, oh, I'm getting money back from the government. Before July 1st, 1943, at the end of the year, you had to write out a check. There was nothing withheld from a paycheck. If you owed the government $10,000, you had to sit down and write out a check for $10,000. Okay? It changed the psychology of taxation, basically. It matters a lot whether you never see the money in the first place or whether you see it and actually have to give it back. In any case, then the invasion of Sicily. So before D-Day, before the invasion of Normandy, Allied forces begin attacking the bottom of Italy and pushing upwards on the Italian peninsula. There was another conference at Tehran, and here you see Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill pictured there in those discussions. And then, to go back to the Pacific, November 20th, the battle for Tarawa. Tarawa is a small atoll in more or less the middle of nowhere in the Pacific. Here, that marks where Tarawa is. Yeah. Here's the Solomon Islands. So down here is the Coral Sea, to give you some indication. But Japan is up that way. And so what were we doing over there anyway? Right? Well, I don't know. It was a significant battle. Here you see some scenes of people approaching the beach at Tarawa, dug in on the beach. A Marine general had this to say about it. Was Tarawa worth it? My answer is unqualified. No. From the very beginning of the decision of the Joint Chiefs to seize Tarawa was a mistake. And from their initial mistake grew the terrible drama of errors of omission rather than commission, resulting in these needless casualties. 1,677 dead among the American side. We should have let Tarawa wither on the vine. We could have kept it neutralized from our bases on Baker Island east or to other islands a short distance to the southeast. But it becomes a moral problem, really. If you're hopping islands, which ones do you fight for? And which ones do you just hop over and ignore? Really, every attack plan was a kind of moral problem in the Pacific. And so you see here American troops lying dead on the beaches of Tarawa. By June 4th, 1944, the D-Day invasion of Normandy, Hitler responded with the first V-1 rocket attacks on Britain. Here you see General Eisenhower with troops before the D-Day attacks. Here he is in a less formal pose. Here's the actual attack. And it's important to stress, the Germans knew this attack was coming. They had known for the previous couple of years. They were very well fortified. The people who were initially on those beaches were basically taking part in a suicide mission. But here they are heading toward the beach. Paratroopers went behind the lines. This is, I think, not the way you're supposed to land. That's the shadow of the V-1 rocket as it heads into London. Now, the D-Day landing was something that managed to succeed partly through incredible courage, partly through a fake that actually succeeded. The people who were committed to where Hitler actually expected the attack to come were also part of a suicide mission, but it helped to draw German forces away from where the attack actually came. Still, that was June, the beginning of June. By August 25th, Paris had been liberated. And so it took just a little less than 3 months. Here you see American troops parading down the Champs-Élysées in Paris, to the jubilant crowds on the side, gathering to cheer, in this case, the captured Nazi soldiers who were there being led through the streets ahead of them. Hitler saw what was happening. Really, from this point on, it was just a question of forces closing in on both sides toward Berlin. And the Germans' one chance to really stop it came at the end of 1944, when they threw everything they had into trying to break through the British and American lines on the Western Front. That's referred to as the Battle of the Bulge. They almost broke through. There was a major attack in the Argonne Forest in the middle of winter, and it almost succeeded. Here you see some scenes from this. One of my colleagues in the philosophy department, who's now retired, was in the Battle of the Bulge. He was wounded. He had a good part of his shoulder shot off, and he had to wait for 3 days in the snow in order to be evacuated. He managed to survive, although he really never had much use of his shoulder after that. But you can see here the conditions of the Battle of the Bulge. Incredibly difficult, very difficult mobility. There's a famous story that the Germans had the American army surrounded completely, and so sent a message to General McAuliffe, who was in charge of the American force there, demanding his surrender. He responded with one word: nuts. Okay? The German sentry took this back to the commanders and, nuts? What is this? Nuts! Okay. Actually, the person who got the message initially, the envoy, looked at this. He said, I don't understand. Nuts? What does this mean? The lieutenant's translation was, it means go to hell. Okay. In any event, the general himself never swore, so this is supposedly the foulest language any of his troops had ever heard from him. Nuts! But from this point on, really, it was a series of American victories pushing the Germans back into Germany on the Western Front. Luckily, an American army managed to break the siege and cut in and destroyed the German advances at the Bulge. So here you see victorious troops afterwards in possession of a Nazi flag. The Soviets, meanwhile, were pushing in from the east. They liberated Auschwitz on January 26th. And then in February, Roosevelt met with Churchill and Stalin at Yalta. Really, not so much to plan the end of the war, here is to plan the post-war world. And we'll talk a lot about that. Or actually, we won't on Monday. If you go to one of the videos, you'll hear a lot about that. I won't be here in person to talk about that. But in any case, 1945, basically the outcome of the war was inevitable. Hitler, by this point, was in his bunker. He was really cutting himself off from reality. Any sensible commander would have realized what was happening and tried to protect Germany by suing for peace. But he didn't do it. He was moving armies around on a board. Nobody had the courage to tell him, look, those armies have been destroyed. They don't even exist. So he kept plotting strategy up until the very end, utterly ignoring the reality of what was happening out in the field. In February, Stalin, actually at Yalta, complained to Roosevelt and Churchill that they weren't doing anything on the Western Front, that he was taking too much of the heat on the Eastern Front. Their response was to arrange for the destruction of Dresden. There was a bombing campaign. 650,000 incendiary bombs were dropped on the city of Dresden, which was really primarily a commercial center. 135,000 people were killed in one night. Goebbels, looking at the result of it, said, it's the work of lunatics. Here's a fleet of American bombers over Germany. Here is the actual attack on Dresden. And here's the aftermath. There were not enough survivors to bury the dead. You can see here the bodies simply being piled up. Huge areas of the city were destroyed. Well, on April 12th, the Allies liberated Buchenwald and Bergen-Belsen, and on that very day, Franklin Delano Roosevelt died. Just a couple of weeks later, Mussolini was hanged by angry Italians who were furious with him for having led them into this mess. Here are some of the scenes at Buchenwald. Elie Wiesel, who wrote a number of famous books about the camps, was actually there. He was in this camp that was liberated and is in that photograph. There were railroad lines leading to the camps. One of the things that is another moral problem, why didn't the Allies do anything to destroy those railroad lines, to stop the transport of people into the camps to be murdered? Most people in the West had no idea what was going on, but the leadership did. Roosevelt did. People came to Roosevelt and begged him to bomb those railway lines. He refused. Why?
Supplies.
Sorry?
Supplies.
I don't know. I have no answer to this, really. it seems as if it would have been, I mean, you're bombing railway lines and bridges and factories and so on all over Germany, right? You're bombing civilian centers. Why not bomb these lines? But it wasn't done. So the killing continued right up to the end of the war. Here you see just a truckload of bodies from the camps. Yes?
Do you think he evaluated it as like not worth the risk? Because, I mean, they could have had possibly lost American lives, and there's no real...
There was no military payoff.
It wasn't, yeah, there was no military payoff.
No, that might be true. I mean, we shouldn't... The way I'm talking about this, it sounds as if, wow, you know, to be up there instead of down on the ground, that must have been a piece of cake. Not really. There is a marvelous movie, I think one of the greatest war movies ever made, called 12 O'Clock High, about these bombing campaigns and the bomber crews. There was a very nice leader who was getting his men killed. And then you see a new leader come in who is tough as nails, but actually gets his troops to survive. But you realize, yes, every bombing raid, you were risking a lot of people's lives. It was not uncommon for a significant percentage of those bombing crews not to come back. And you had to send lots of fighters to go along. They would face Messerschmitts, they would face flak from the ground, anti-aircraft fire. This was an enormously dangerous thing to do. So you may be right. It may simply have been, I can't afford to lose bombing crews and fighter pilots for something that has no military value. In any case, whatever the reason, nothing was done to stop all of this. There was a question in the back. No. Okay. Well, April 30th, Hitler finally realized what was taking place. He basically was having to evacuate one bunker for another because of troops coming so close to Berlin. And rather than face capture, he decided to commit suicide. His last words are reported to have been, afterwards, "You rue the fact that you've been so kind." This is one of the last photographs of Hitler alive. You see he's cuddling the Hitler Youth. Yes?
You know anything about his marriage? Like, I know he got married the day before he committed suicide, but, like, for me it was just like, why would he do that?
That's a good question. Well, yeah, okay. You've been living with this woman for years, and you finally marry her, actually, on the day before you commit suicide. Actually, you know, I had an uncle who, well, was divorced when he was quite young, but then, near the end of his life, lived for a number of years with someone, and they got married when he was dying, and he knew he had like only a week left. So why, yeah, I don't know. Why would people do that? I mean, it's like, when I thought I had a future, I wasn't willing to commit it to you, but now that I don't. I mean, I think it's meant to be a romantic gesture, right? But it's somehow the way I think about it, it doesn't seem very romantic. It's like, yes, I commit my last day to you. Thanks a lot. No, I don't know. Women. A guy makes this grant, you know, you've been living together for years. You've wanted to get married. He doesn't. Finally, he finds out he has a day or a week to live, and he says, let's get married. Is this awesome, or is this... I don't know. Help me out here.
Didn't they commit suicide together?
They did commit suicide together. Yeah. So, hey, I don't know. Yeah, good question. I have no answer. In any case, the war in the Pacific was going to continue for a while. There were some very difficult battles. In fact, battles got more and more difficult as the American forces approached the Japanese mainland. February 19th to March 26th, Iwo Jima. This is a small island. You can see here it's halfway between Guam and the Japanese mainland. It was to be an important naval base, as well as an important area for planes to take off and bomb Japan. And so the Japanese did everything they could to prevent the Americans from capturing the island. Here you see an American carrier listing, and the troops going to the other side to try to avoid falling off of it. And there's another indication of where Iwo Jima is. This is what it looks like. There is really one big mound, Mount Suribachi, on the island. Otherwise, it's more or less one long beach. There you see troops on the beach. The Japanese were dug in on the sides of that mountain and at the top, and so had a commanding view of this area. Here is a soldier advancing across what became known to the troops there as Death Valley, because the Japanese up on the hill could clearly see this area And so crossing it was an immensely dangerous thing to do. This is the famous photograph that Roy showed you of people planting the flag on the top. And that's the one they thought was going to be the famous photograph. There was a counterattack, by the way, about a week later, and almost everyone you see in that photograph celebrating was killed. But yes, the famous one is the one that sort of everyone remembers. Well, shortly after that was the Battle of Okinawa. If it took about 6 weeks to take Iwo Jima, Okinawa, the battle lasted from April 1st to July 2nd, so it was really all of April, May, June. It was a 3-month battle for a very small island. The fighting was incredibly vicious. Hundreds of thousands killed. Here is where Okinawa is, basically halfway between Japan and Taiwan. Iwo Jima would be over here, and so you can see it's also important because of its ability to be a base for bombing Japan. The fighting at Okinawa was especially savage. Japanese soldiers dug into caves on the island. It was an immensely difficult thing to fight people in the caves. Here you see a kamikaze plane headed toward an American carrier. This became an increasingly popular tactic among the Japanese forces. These suicide pilots would be in these small manned aircrafts, and their job was to maneuver this and crash it into a ship. Imagine being the photographer who sees that coming right at you and takes the picture. I would have been running. But anyway, yeah, this one actually missed. It did not hit. But these people were trained to fly these things. They were trained to sort of dedicate themselves to this suicidal mission. They were treated as great heroes up to the moment they got into the plane and had to actually do this. But they were devastatingly effective. They were very good at avoiding fire and so actually hitting ships. And so they were taking a tremendous toll. Here you see a ship that was hit by one of the kamikaze attacks. There's another. Here you see an aircraft being destroyed in aerial battles around Okinawa. There you see troops heading toward the shore. A dive bomber attack. Well, in any case, these battles were so costly in Japanese lives and American lives that they helped to shape the decision about the end of the war. Once the American forces had taken Okinawa, there was really nothing left between there and the Japanese mainland. The next thing was to be an invasion of Japan. But the estimates were that that was going to cost somewhere between 1 million and 2 million American lives, many more Japanese lives. The Japanese were promising to fight to the death. And so, August 6th, an atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. And then 3 days later, another one dropped on Nagasaki. Hiroshima was the main target. Nagasaki was not. There was bad weather over the main target. It was the secondary target. And then, just 5 days later, Japan surrendered. The bombs, well, here you see Little Boy, one of the bombs. There's what it did. Here you see Hiroshima after the attack. That's what's left of the city, a few structures. Then the bomb on Nagasaki, the entire city destroyed. The ruins of a temple on the hillside survive. This gives you an idea of the city before the attack, the city after the attack. And these circles, that was where the bomb was actually detonated. This is a kilometer, 2 kilometers, 3 kilometers, and so on. You can see the almost overwhelming destruction throughout that entire area. Here is the scene of the surrender. And the jubilation afterwards. That's Times Square at the end of the war.